for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda Carney. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week I've got two guests, Lizzie Penny and Alex Hirst, who are co-authors of Workstyle, and they're co-CEOs of Hoxby, which is a marketing and future of work consultancy. And we're going to talk to them about their new book and their methodology Workstyle, and also this sort of work that they've been doing through their consultancy. So Lizzie, Alex, hi there and welcome.
Thank you for having us.
And first of all, what is Workstyle? I was quite intrigued by it. I've had a little look at your stuff online. And it's piqued my interest, but I don't exactly know what it is. So who can enlighten me?
I'll start. I'll try and enlighten you. So Workstyle is a word that we created to mean the complete freedom to choose when and where you work for yourself, on the basis that we have such freedom to choose and design our lifestyle, but really haven't had the same ability and autonomy to decide our work style for ourselves. It's been very much a case of working typically 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, or some variation on that theme. And we felt that in the digital age and the ability to work from anywhere and at any time, increasingly, we needed a word to enable people to talk about their individual preference for when and where to work in a way that wasn't loaded with prejudice or stereotype of working, anything other than a traditional 9 to 5, be that a part-timer or a flexible worker or someone who's shirking from home, as we often heard. So Workstyle is the complete freedom to choose when and where you work.
Okay. And I mean, it's interesting, of course, when and where we work, and we know that we've had more flexibility imposed on us actually by COVID. And then I'm hearing more and more employers imposing less flexibility back. So is this something that you're seeing that everyone should be able to do? I guess that one of the challenges also is not everyone can choose their work style. I'm assuming in certain industries it's not so much. So are you targeting this at certain industries?
Yes, we are. I think that we feel that this is an attitude as well as a systemic change for work. So we feel that everyone should have the freedom to choose when and where they work, but we recognise that for some industries that's easier than others. So this fits perfectly with the knowledge economy. There are 2.5 million businesses in the UK knowledge economy, and globally there are around 1 billion knowledge workers. So even if only knowledge workers adopted work-style working, it could have a really significant impact on the world of work. However, there are also other industries where there is a pressing need to work differently. That might be companies that have an aging workforce and need to find a way to retain them in the future. It could be areas of employment that are in crisis, such as midwifery in the UK. And actually in the book, we have a case study on a company called Bertsorg, and that shows how it can be applied to the nursing profession. So I think for us, we recognise that we champion one extreme of work style, which is everyone having the complete freedom to choose when and where they work. But for some organisations, it's going to be more about adopting the mindset of how can we give more autonomy to our workforce and recognise the individualised nature of work, and that everyone now has different circumstances that mean they may work most productively in different ways.
Yeah, I didn't say, but should have said, we came up with the word Workstyle in 2014. So this predates the pandemic, and actually was the result of us observing radical shifts that were happening in the landscape of work even long before the pandemic. So technology was enabling us to work from anywhere. We were tethering to our mobile phones, from our laptops to work from parks. The gig economy was booming. And there are 4.6 million self-employed people in the UK, and it's one of the fastest growing labour forces that we have. But also that the population was aging. The demographic of the workforce is shifting hugely. And actually, these things kind of came together to show us that the current structure of work and the current way of thinking about work in terms of fixed time and place is no longer relevant. So though the pandemic has served as a bit of a catalyst for writing the book, the shift towards this way of working was happening long before.
And actually, it's not only generated, I suppose, a catalyst for the book and change people having to use digital and accept and get to use things like that. Thinking about Zoom and all the Teams and all the sort of things that we now all use daily. But it's also exacerbated it because there's been a lot of people who've left the workforce. So the whole thing about keeping your aging workers or keeping those skills, there's more of an issue than ever, isn't there, in terms of keeping people involved?
Absolutely. And just to give you a statistic, 21% of the worldwide population will be over 60 by 2050. We simply cannot keep on functioning as productive economies without changing the way that we work in order to involve more older workers. So yes, the pandemic has made us more adept at using technologies and understanding the right combination of technologies. For example, we've always worked on Slack. We don't have an office at Hawksby. Slack is our office. But I think there is a big element of this that is about understanding the groups that are fundamentally excluded from work by our current 9-to-5, 5-day-a-week working structure, which is 200 years old. It's a legacy from Sir Robert Owen and the Industrial Revolution, and understanding that those excluded groups have a meaningful contribution to bring to work, but they are systemically excluded. And so making this change will not only mean that they can be included in work, it will improve our diversity of our organisations, which, as we all know, produces better outcomes as well.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm really keen to find out more about how we can do that. And particularly, I really liked the fact that you've got an example. I've just been listening to the radio about the midwifery crisis, the NHS. You've got examples in industries that aren't just knowledge workers, obviously, which are less easy to find a fix. So I'm keen to hear more about that later. But before we go there, let me understand a little bit more about how you two got into this, because you've both got quite interesting backgrounds, haven't you?
Yes, so Alex and I came to that conversation in the pub or through different routes. So I had worked in a traditional way, and I then had a child. And it was when I had my first child that I'm kind of embarrassed to say, really, that opened my eyes to the pervasive inequalities at work. And until then, my husband and I had really equal careers. I'd worked really hard. I'd progressed at the same rate. And then suddenly I had a child, and I found that actually it didn't suit me to not only work 5 days a week, but to work in the day when he was awake. I wasn't going out anymore in the evening. I might as well be working in the evening. And I didn't want to be judged on when and where I was working. I wanted to be judged on the output that I was putting into it. So for me, that was the real catalyst, was becoming a parent and then recognizing that these other groups were excluded. But since then, I've also had some changes in my life circumstances. I had some serious complications in my second pregnancy with my twin daughters. I've moved across the country to little old Bristol and had no interruption to how I work. And also I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2020, which already was a bit of a hectic year for everyone. And so for me, this is profoundly personal, because I've gone from just wanting for myself to work as a parent in a new way to actually finding that this has been something of a lifeline for me through some of the toughest times of my life, to be able to keep working in a way that I find really motivating and fulfilling during difficult times. So I won't say Alex's story. I'll let him tell his own, because it's slightly different from mine.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Slightly different. So I have had, well, my wife has had children recently, so I can relate to that side. But actually, my story predates becoming a father. I was somebody who enjoyed working hard. I put in typically a 60-hour week. I liked to be first in the office and last out, and I did that for a good number of years. And it would be easy to say that I didn't enjoy it in hindsight, but actually I did. I really got a lot of positive energy from it. But eventually I burnt out, and I reached a sort of psychological low where I no longer enjoyed it, and actually felt a kind of numb ambivalence to it. I didn't really feel the highs or the lows in the same way as I had before. And at a small but growing business, those highs and lows are acute. And so I kind of got to the point where I had to do something about it. I took some time off, some time away, a week away, a holiday. But I can't tell you anything about that holiday. I have literally very little by way of memory or recollection of it, because I wasn't really present while I was there. And psychologically, the thing that I realized coming off that was that it wasn't time off that I needed. I needed to just rethink how I was thinking about work, what I was appraising my success on. Was it really valid to think that a 60-hour week is doing a good job, or should I be looking at it differently? Should I be considering in terms of output and outcomes rather than hours spent? And that was the kind of eye-opening moment for me, really, and the thing that helped me to realize that I needed to stop thinking in terms of time and start thinking in terms of output, which led me to a conversation with Lizzie in the pub. And we both realized we kind of wanted the same thing, which was the autonomy to decide when and where we work for ourselves, and the freedom to be judged on what we output, not what we input.
Did you need to have like something when you're working 60 hours a week? You can't have had that much life out of work. I mean, you said you had kids, but often when something in your life becomes important to you outside of work, then you kind of have a motivation to get things down.
Well, yes. I mean, Olivia, our daughter, wasn't even a twinkle at the time, I must admit. The reality was my wife called me out and said, you're a shadow of yourself. She'd asked me a simple question like, what should we have for dinner? And I wouldn't have an answer. And so it was her sort of holding up a mirror, really, that helped me to see that there was a problem and something that we needed to fix. And then once that had happened, once we fixed it and, Workstyle and Hoxby had been created, that actually gave us the platform to start a family, which is amazing. But it wasn't the thing, if you like, that started the process.
I mean, it's interesting when you're working 60 hours a week. You've got a question actually, if you were burnt out outside of it, whether you were your best you for all of those hours as well, right?
Quite, absolutely. And in hindsight, it's very obvious, and perhaps it was obvious to people around me, but it's quite a hard thing to see for yourself, I think.
Yeah. It's all about quality, isn't it, here? So I can totally get why you're passionate about that, and what we want to do is kind of explore more about how we can make that happen, I guess, and how could HR professionals, which is the majority of our audience, or employers, think about being open-minded about this approach, maybe. What thoughts have you got there?
Yeah, I think in terms of adopting a work style approach, we recognise that the way we work and the way Hoxby is structured is quite radical. So the first thing we would say is read the book. It lays out everything in our heads. And the reason we wrote the book, as Alex alluded to earlier, was because during the pandemic, everyone wanted to talk to us about how we worked. We wanted to open source it to everyone, and there just wasn't time for those conversations. So that's really where the book came from. The second thing is that for us, we went looking for work style organizations when we came up with the concept, and they didn't exist. And so we created Hoxby, a social enterprise and now B Corp, as a test environment for Workstyle. We wanted to prove that you can do brilliant work, you can have people having great wellbeing levels, and that you can include people who otherwise wouldn't be included in work in an actual functioning way. And we knew we needed to prove that before anyone would really listen to us and believe that this could be done. And the pandemic certainly helped with people being open to this conversation. It was much harder for people to understand it. There were a lot more naysayers before the pandemic. But we learned 3 things very quickly with setting up Hoxby. So the first was that work needs to be done asynchronously rather than synchronously. So people need to be able to work in a way that doesn't require them to be in the same time and at the same place at the same time. So being able to be asynchronous is really important to Workstyle. The second thing is that we all need to adopt a digital first mentality. It's amazing how many people will still say, oh, we need to have a meeting face to face to discuss that. It's just not true. You know, we've got Hoxbys that Alex and I have never met. We've worked with hugely productively for years, and we've never met them in real life. They're in other countries, and that's completely fine. And so moving to that digital first mentality is really important. And then the third thing we quickly found was that a trust-based culture is fundamentally needed to underpin Workstyle. It doesn't work if you don't have that trust. And so culture is really important in how you can possibly adopt Workstyle, even in any kind of a pilot or in a small way. And that also requires an understanding of remote leadership. So leading in a way that is inclusive when you're all working remotely. The other thing that we've mentioned, but I think is really important for anyone who's looking to adopt a bit more of a Workstyle way of working, is the concept of autonomy. And obviously lots of people are talking about autonomy at the moment, but I think we're talking about genuine autonomy here rather than just flexing at the edges, rather than being in the out-group dynamic that just happens to not work on a Friday and you feel like you're missing out on all the fun stuff at work. This is about true autonomy to choose when and where you work. And that makes people more productive. You know, even autonomy over the layout of your workspace can make you 32% more productive. And autonomy has been proven time and again to improve productivity in all different ways. You know, better work-life balance, better job satisfaction, better engagement and productivity are all improved where stress, staff turnover, exhaustion are all decreased. So we know that autonomy is really good, but a lot of organizations can't quite see that link to putting it into practice. And we think that piloting Workstyle could be the answer to that.
So, I mean, why those, I get your 4 points. I can see asynchronous. I suppose what I'm thinking, I can see all of those things being essential and key aspects to it. And I can also hear fellow HR professionals saying, yes, but in my organization, right? So asynchronous working, when we've worked with developers that are on a different time zone, that works, but it means you've got to wait 24 hours to move a project on, whereas you could be face to face. So there would be an objection there. In terms of something like the trust-based thing, is that about the culture of the organization? Is it about the individual managers? What are they scared of? Is everybody ready for autonomy? I'm sure you've had these sort of things. So how would you address some of those sort of yes, but questions?
There are loads of yes, but questions, Lucinda. And actually, that's what we love, because I think the point of Workstyle is to start a conversation. It's for us to start a conversation about whether we are working in a way that is appropriate for the era that we live in now. And we have spent 8 years running a big experiment at Hoxby to see how this works in practice. And that doesn't mean there haven't been myriad challenges to overcome in doing so. So we love those conversations. In terms of things that need to happen quickly, it's amazing how you can bring together mesh work styles, as we talk about. So work styles that fit perfectly together to deliver things quickly. So for instance, we have a studio offering, which is a design studio, and we have people working on that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because we've got people in 35 countries who each set their own work styles. And so we understand people's work styles. They're transparent with us about that. And we can set up for things to be happening either 24 hours always on, or to have a big group of people coming together they might not all be based in the UK, for instance. Some people might be working in the evening in the US or Asia in order for us to make that happen. So I think there are levels of infrastructure that are needed. And then I also think there is, like you said, this cultural element. So a lot of people say to us, well, you just don't get the same connection, which I think is part of what you're alluding to in terms of trust. But actually, more than half of Brits say they suffer from loneliness in the workplace anyway. Let's not be fooled to thinking that when people are sitting in the same room, they're not lonely. Connection isn't about physically being together. It's about connecting on a deeper level. So actually, I think Workstyle opens up the opportunity to connect people and bring together teams in a different way and engage them in a different way, but to do it purposely. Whereas I think sometimes if you are together in the same physical space, there can be the belief that simply by doing that, that's enough to create connection. Whereas when you're working in a remote way, you have to purposely do that to bring people together.
I would add as well, we're at the start of this revolution. People have been working in the traditional way for more than 200 years. Much of the practices around work and what we believe are anchored in times when we were a manufacturing economy. We needed to be in factories for shift patterns that we don't anymore. And the book and Hoxby are designed to show people that times have really changed, and perhaps we should be rethinking the very operating system of work and using that stimulus to enable people to apply fresh thinking to whatever their line of work is. So it's to inspire fresh thinking as much as anything else, understanding that we are at the dawn of a new revolution. In another 200 years' time, if we're still working to shared hours of 9 to 5 and offices, I will be very, very surprised. In fact, we will have learned how to work asynchronously. We will be more trust-based, and we will be able to be digital first. It'll be an inherent part of the way we work, that we all have a work style. But we have to overcome our fear of change and our reticence to adopt new practices in order to move it forward. And I think what's happening now with post-pandemic decisions is this is the time that people will look back on and determine whether humanity took the opportunity that was in front of them or not, took the opportunity to embrace the digital age and the attitudinal shift created by the pandemic to fundamentally do something different, or whether they reverted back to the safety and comfort zone of the way we've been doing it for 200 years.
When I've talked about flexible working and hybrid working, all those sorts of things, I think that's very narrow-minded for many employers, because people undoubtedly want a work style or flexibility at the very least, and they're going to vote with their feet in terms of retaining people and that sort of thing. So I can see that's the case.
I think that's right. I think organisations are recognising that they need to have flexible and hybrid working in order to attract and retain talent. I guess our concerns is whether it goes far enough. And, flexible working, for example, again, we talk in the book about the specific areas where we feel it's not going far enough. And there are 3 challenges with it. I love a 3. Firstly, it's based on an industrial age system. It's still just flexing around it at the edge. Mm-hmm. The second thing is it's creating in-group, out-group dynamics. So the majority of the workforce might be in the office 9 to 5, at least a few days a week. And so the people who are not feel excluded in some way. And then the third thing is it's just not creating change fast enough. In the book, we talk about 7 excluded groups, and these are people who are structurally excluded from work. So that's older workers, carers, those with chronic illness, physical disabilities, mental health challenges, parents, or people who are neurodivergent. Those groups are all structurally excluded from work currently in some way. And flexible working is not driving change fast enough. And in some of those areas, it's not driving change at all. Autism, for instance, we're seeing it going in the wrong direction in terms of the gap statistics there for how many people want to work but can't. So that's why we feel that flexible working is almost our biggest threat, because organizations think that is the answer, pay lip service to it, whereas they're not fundamentally restructuring work enough.
Can I ask a basic question? This on a lot of those, I can understand why people are excluded from work. I can see those. I don't understand why the neurodivergent is excluded or why Workstyle helps. Could you help me understand that?
Yeah, so that is because for many people who are neurodivergent, sensory overload is a really important characteristic. And so for them, needing to be in a physical office space is often really overwhelming. And for many, they'll self-select out of working simply because they don't want to do that. The foreword to the book is written by Dame Stephanie Shirley, who was an amazing campaigner for inclusion at work and specifically around neurodiversity as well, but also someone who had a crazy idea in the 70s to start a radically different way of working. And she has spoken a lot about this as well, about the important role that hugely talented group of people could play in the workforce, but that they're currently being structurally excluded from work because of us going to a place and often working in open plan offices, for instance. Suddenly a birthday cake comes out, everyone's singing happy birthday, and they weren't told it was going to happen. Just small things like that can make a really big difference.
Yeah, I guess I would have been completely unaware of that in my times in an office. And you probably have to go and sit, the commuting as well would add to that overload.
Absolutely.
I was interested. Right,
sorry, I was just going to say, I think the important thing for all of these groups and that autonomy enables is choice, for people to decide for themselves what works for them. And what we mustn't do is fall into a trap of assuming that what works for one person works for everyone, because that is the problem with traditional work and work that is mandated by an employer. What we need is to create the conditions to give people the tools and the autonomy to decide for themselves. Now, that will throw up fresh challenges, particularly for neurodivergent people to set those boundaries. But it is in the pursuit of something better in the future, a more inclusive future of work, that those challenges can be overcome. So though there will be fresh and different challenges creating that autonomy, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that it's worth doing.
Nice. The notes, that it's interesting that where you went there with that, because I'd written down earlier project management. I'll explain where I'm going with it. You use these things about changing the operating system of work, which it's almost flipping things on its head. And I thought earlier when you were thinking, how do you get people to work on this project? It's almost project management has always been sort of about the project, not about the people, and the people had to slot into it. So it's almost, we're going, let's look at the people's things and we'll work out, right, that's how we've just got more jigsaw pieces, or we start with the people's wants to make it work. It's starting in a different place, it feels, which is thinking things quite differently for many employers, and it's not traditional. Just going on to the ones that I was really interested in, whether you can share one of the case studies or something. How have you say you've had some success with nursing or some shift type working, something where it's a more tricky environment, or traditionally you'd go, it's non-knowledge worker. Have you got an example you could share where you've had success with a non-knowledge working type environment?
Well, I think Lizzie talked about Workstyle earlier in the conversation, which is an organisation out of the Netherlands who are they are a distributed community of nurses, and what they do is, rather than operate in the traditional healthcare pyramid, they empower nurses to work independently and as groups within communities to support the needs of local residents. So those nurses are they work as a team, but they undertake a broader range of responsibilities than a nurse might in a hospital setting, for example. So they're empowered to triage and provide a personal care program for an individual that means that they can manage their own workload, as a group, and also provide an efficient service as a private service. That is a business that was started with enabling autonomy in mind, and actually much of the business is technology led, but it's also with a human understanding that you can access more people who can provide care to people who need it better through a system that is geographically flexible than a system that is geographically inflexible. So rather than having a fixed number of people operating in a hospital setting, having a limitless number of people operating out in the community. And really that's just an example of approaching the problem of providing care to a great number of people in a completely different way. And that's the kind of level of rethinking that we're hoping that Workstyle can inspire.
Is it similar with the midwives, as in, so they were kind of empowered to support in a certain way? Or is that in a hospital environment?
The midwives was more an example of an area that needs Workstyle than one that's actually adopted it. We would love to do some Workstyle work with midwifery because we feel like it's an area that really needs it, but we haven't seen that yet. But we feel like it's where there's a crisis that actually organisations or the NHS will have to look at different approaches. And therefore, that's where we might see the fastest change, which often comes from a crisis.
Yeah, thinking how could we make it work in some way to get the resources back up. And because of course, actually, if you think about it, in something like the health service, you don't really find people who are more motivated to do a great job than people like that. They're in it from a vocational point of view. It's just not constraining, giving them the opportunity to work when they want, where they want, and deliver great practice. Yet again, the controls sometimes are counterproductive, aren't they? We're not going to solve it today, but
we'd like to.
That would be amazing. Okay, so bringing this all together, we've talked about a little bit about how HR can support it, or maybe are there any practical tips you've got to do with what HR or employers can do to maybe just dip their toe in the water, to be a bit more radical about Workstyle, and also the kind of benefits that they'd expect to get from this?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we haven't talked about yet is the benefit of having more diverse organizations. So obviously the ability to enable autonomy and be more inclusive in the way that we've talked about, attracting these otherwise excluded people into our organizations, can increase the diversity of our people, our cognitive diversity, and therefore our collective intelligence. We are fascinated by the science of collective intelligence, and we're trying to apply it a lot at Hoxby to the projects we do. So from an organizational point of view, we think there's a huge amount that can be gained there by eliminating groupthink and homogeneity and replacing it with diversity, constructive criticism, challenging thought, and hopefully an increased collective intelligence. So from an organizational point of view, there's a massive opportunity there to be had, not to mention the societal one of including people in work who otherwise wouldn't.
In terms of the tips that you talked about, I think the main thing that we would talk about is the framework we use in the book, which is set, project, and respect your own work style. So for anyone in an organisation that wants to look to try and adopt a bit of a work style mentality, that's the process we would suggest that they go through. So start by encouraging individuals to really consider what they want their work style to be, to consider their individual circumstances and how their work could fit around it, and how they can work where they're most productive. For instance, some people are larks, some people are night owls. Then the second thing is project it. So telling people about your work style, and organizations creating a forum where people can talk openly and with confidence about their individual working preferences in that way. And then respecting the work style. And that's really about boundary setting and making those boundaries as non-negotiable as possible. The interesting thing that we found at Hoxby is that actually people are much better at respecting other people's work styles than they are respecting their own. And so depending on the organisation, there could be challenges either way with that. But set, project and respect is the overall framework that we would suggest for anyone wanting to give it a go.
Yeah, and that in itself is another piece in terms of us as individuals learning how to think for ourselves and learning how to be autonomous and to prioritise our whole well-being and that sort of thing.
It's the skill for the work style worker and the future of work. we think.
I do some of my best work, Lucinda, when I'm folding the washing. Some of my best thinking, and taking time out in the middle of the afternoon, if I'm in a bit of a blocker, to go and fold the washing is not something you would think is a really productive way to work. But for me, it's a very productive way to work.
About getting it done, and different times of day as well. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast. Your book was out on the 13th of October, so we'll put the link in the show notes for anyone who'd like to go and order it for themselves. Best of luck with where you're going with this. It's great to see some radical thinking and some challenging think the way we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.